Welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, everybody. My name is Kowal Campo.
And mine's Mike Pierce. As ever, fogginess abounds in our attempts to deliver Olympian judgments on pretty much everything. But we keep trying.
Yes, unfortunately for our viewers.
Don't get them to bail on us just yet.
Right. Yeah, hold on for a bit longer. And just to recap what we've been inflicting upon everybody, in our first episode of this mini-series, we looked at the life and career of C.S. Lewis and the circumstances under which this extraordinary book appeared.
And last week, we looked at the contents and the central arguments of The Abolition of Man.
Right. So, in this final episode of the mini-series,
Before we move on to something else exciting next week,
which we'll announce properly later on, but today we're going to consider what Lewis's argument means for us in the present.
right. So, just to summarize the central contentions of the book, and this is a little bit in the way of recapitulation of what we covered last week. Firstly, that you and I have no title to select which bits of traditional received values, honour, respect, compassion, self-restraint, group loyalty, willingness to sacrifice, etc., that we wish, for reasons of our own, to accept and uphold, and which we wish to slough off as superstitious bunkum.
Now, is bunkum your word for this or his?
Mine, I think, yes. Do we not say that in America? I'm still learning.
I'm afraid not yet, anyway.
Okay. All right.
Well, anyway, we already mentioned some examples of this cherry picking of values, one being Nazism, or loyalty to your country or ethnos, and the other communism, which is wanting to have equality in a perfect society, and how picking and choosing your values, you end up with really a monstrous evil.
Right. And this includes our loss of reverence for the natural world. Conquest of nature, as he calls it, and is indeed all his contemporaries called it, is in reality, he says, the conquest of some men by other men using nature as their instrument.
Yes, and he'd taken the radio, the airplane, and the contraceptives as his illustrations, I believe.
Right. And finally, in casting off such restraints to the point of conquering our own species, we actually become the playthings of a tiny elite who are, in turn, dominated not by reason at all, but by their own irrational, animal, natural desires.
Yeah, and this seemed very creepy at the time, and probably even creepier when we think how much closer to the actualization of such things we've come over the past 80 years.
Yes, yes. We are much closer to the kind of rather fuzzy doomsday that he indicates now than we were then. So, as far as that's concerned, his argument might be considered vindicated in another way, in that events have in fact followed the kind of trajectory that he said they would if we let go of that traditional morality.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis being ahead of his time, as usual.
Well, yes. I mean, this is really why his work generally, not just this book, has endured. And as I think we mentioned on another occasion, he's probably more popular now, even than during his own lifetime. Well, the book has consequences for three principal areas that we want to mention today. Firstly, obviously, morality and ethics. That is really what the book's about. But two other things that don't get a look in, but for which his argument nevertheless has profound consequences. So, Christian apologetics, which we'll come to in a moment, and the basis for social engagement.
Yeah, and this is interesting because, as we mentioned last time, he doesn't actually reference God at all in the book. And so it's interesting to see Christian apologetics as being drawn as a conclusion from this.
Well, yeah, well, we're going to get into that in just a few minutes. Okay, but to begin with the first of those, morality and ethics, and you'll forgive the slightly cheesy picture that I picked to go in here. All right. His argument simultaneously renders the rationalist take on ethics ridiculous because self defeating.
Now, it's a rationalist take on ethics because it debunks the idea that anything has intrinsic or objective value.
Right. And he wants to say that's wrong. It does have intrinsic and objective value. If we treat physical and natural objects as mere quantity, we lose a lot. It helps us to make certain kinds of technological gains, but we also lose a whole load of other things, and we've lost sight of that. But when we actually get to the point where the physical object is ourselves and our own species, then the whole process undoes itself and starts to unravel. Yes. And he defends traditional morality as the only game in town.
Yeah, and we're saying the only game because Lewis says we can no more come up with a new value than we can invent a new primary color. Values just are, they exist.
Right. And what's being said by lots of the innovators, as he calls them in his own time, the modernists, is that we need to find a new basis for ethics. And he examines the main things that they proffer and tests them to destruction without much difficulty, it has to be said. Yeah. And thirdly, his argument establishes a potential common arena for moral discussion between all people.
Yeah, and this will be because, as Lewis saw it, traditional moral codes overlapped very considerably in what he called the Tao.
Yes, he points to that considerable area of overlap. And there's an appendix, not a particularly big one, at the back of the book, which gives a whole load of examples from different traditional moral codes around the world, showing how they all tend in the same general kinds of direction. Okay, but one thing that we need to clear up here is perhaps get a little bit away from moral absolutes kind of language. What we're talking about, it becomes apparent from the way that Lewis discusses this, is mutually limiting absolutes. That is, that all of these things are important. He's quite clear that there are countless very real moral dilemmas in the world as we find it. And it's just foolish to try and pretend that that isn't the case. But the fact that moral commands often conflict with one another does not invalidate the commands. It means that only those who stand under them, so to speak, can ever be in a position to judge which moral principle should have precedence in a particular hard case. What we have then is not moral absolutes in the sense that some fundamentalists might insist upon, but a whole set of mutually self limiting moral precepts. This is not in a simple boilerplate solution to every moral problem. It's rather ruling out the modernist debunking or ultra pragmatic approach to morals in favour of becoming moral people.
So Lewis isn't being simplistic at all. He's admitting that there aren't cut and dried moral solutions to every situation.
Right, and he appears to sympathise with Aristotle that morality is not simply a code, do this, don't do that, although he thinks that it is that, but becoming a moral person. And that when you become a moral person, you will know how to apply the code, the Tao, in given situations.
Right. And he uses the example of a good tennis player who, by practice, is so used to making good shots that he or she does it almost as like a second nature.
Right. And that's why he thinks that education of children is so important. He points out that the ancients considered that the part of the purpose of education was to train up the child to love, hate, detest, and be loyal to the things that he or she should. So it's partly a training process. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, some of us can get to be quite an old age without this becoming second nature.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I shall have my revenge in this life or the next.
Right.
Okay, so what he's arguing for, in a way, is not a debunking, but an anti debunking, a re enchantment of the world. Now, Max Weber had observed that modernity is characterized by what he called the progressive disenchantment of the world.
Okay, now Weber was the author of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and we considered him in the third episode of our series on what did the Reformation do for us.
Yes, according to Weber, we've become more and more pragmatic and functionalist in our approach to everything. He was concerned primarily with economics, of course, and this has led us toward a world increasingly denuded of meaning. As this process goes forward, life appears more and more meaningless because we have made it so. We have debunked every possible meaning, and now as we're finding every possible identity.
This is like the modernist obsession with having an answer for everything.
Yes, that everything is in principle explicable in terms of quantity, mathematics, and so on, or economics, which is in some ways just a branch of mathematics, at least the way it has traditionally been practiced. So this leads to the disintegration of morality amidst much else, because we can say, oh, this is merely blah, 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 blah. And that's everything Lewis is tilting against. So the abolition of man demands a kind of re-enchantment of the world in which we live. Now, today, we are witnessing not only a new environmentalism, which is saying, look at our clever industrial revolution, look at the way it's destroyed the environment, the only planet we could ever live on. But strong movements are emerging in more recent years for reinstating beauty in architecture, non functionalism, and indeed even in ordinary manufactured goods. Now, these are not as all pervasive as the environmental movement yet, but they are making progress. They're winning small to medium sized victories and they're clearly moving forward. I find that very cheering, actually, because the landscape as a whole is generally nothing to be applauded. But some of our older viewers might remember E.F. Schumacher and his Small is Beautiful back in the 1970s, whose brilliant subtitle was Economics as Though People Mattered, which obviously they do. Now, his counsel hasn't generally been adhered to in the years since, but that kind of argument continues to have resonance. And so that's the general direction in which Lewis is pushing. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point because you could take the abolition of man and put that next to the Chronicles of Narnia and say, how did the same man write about magic and talking animals? But he also comes out with, this brilliant, very logically sound argument. And I think this is kind of the link between those things. He's pushing for this re-enchantment. And I think he saw the magic of Narnia as kind of an extension of that.
Right. We need to keep reminding ourselves that he was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. And weren't you? I'm trying to remember. You and I were having some kind of back and forth a couple of years ago about Lewis on medieval re-enchantment or something. I'm trying to remember what book it was now. This book. We did talk about that, didn't we?
Yes, you were kind enough to send it to me.
Did I? My gosh.
I think
I must
so.
have can't see me doing such a thing. Okay, yeah, and I think we had some discussion about that. How the idea of an enchanted or a non-materialistic universe saturated everything that he thought, and here it is in the abolition of man. So, just to restate that for anybody who missed me flashing this quickly across the screen, this is Jason Baxter, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis.
which I found to
That's
be a great and I don't think terribly difficult read. I think it was pretty straightforward.
right. All the books I send you are good.
Of course. You can always send
Oh
me
my
more.
God. Yes, yeah. Okay, so the second area that we need to look at here is Christian apologetics.
Yes, and just a quick reminder that apologetics means, in this context, arguments in the defense of Christian belief. And also that we did a whole series on this, which you can
Yes,
view at this link.
exactly. And viewers, you should. Right. Yeah, we did about 4 episodes on that, didn't we? I think, or 5, something of the sort. You'll see when you go and have a look. Okay, so there's one sentence in The Abolition of Man which continues to wrinkle with me because I think he's being a little disingenuous. He says right in the middle of the book, in order to avoid misunderstanding, I may add that though I myself am a theist and indeed a Christian, I'm not here attempting any indirect argument for theism. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, you terrible liar. Obviously, what?
Why is Lewis's statement so disingenuous?
Well, because the one thing really does lead to the other. The person who wants to buy Lewis's argument in this book is going to have a bit of a problem if they want to remain an atheist. Because it does raise the rather obvious question, well, where does this Tao come from? How come it's here? They could end up as a sort of mystic, I suppose. Insofar as this statement of his is completely ingenuous, and I don't think it is, but insofar as it is, it must be because of the use of the word indirect. Because, in fact, it's a very direct argument for theism. The straight line from Lewis's case about values to theism is pretty direct.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't spent as much time pondering this book as you have, perhaps you will show us why the line from values to theism is so direct.
Well, because without the existence of God, there's nothing to underpin these values as to why you should do them, nor is there anything to account for their origin. You could be a sort of mystic who says, well, we can't possibly say why they're here, which is a possible position, right? You certainly couldn't be a materialist, because if you're going to be just a materialist and say matter is all that exists, well, morality is just a word game, right?
Right.
So if we're going to say that these values are real things, adhering in objects and demanding, borrowing his words here, demanding our response whether we make it or not, that rather strongly implies an origin for this Tao.
Right.
And that brings us to Romans. Christians have the advantage that Romans 1:18 to 20 explains. This is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the Roman Church, written very early in the life of the church. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In other words, the reality of God and of the moral law, because remember at the start of that passage, he's talking about people's unrighteousness, their unrighteous behavior, that this is kind of impregnated into the physical universe in rather the way that Lewis is arguing for. And in favour of his argument, it has to be said that pretty much all traditional societies have accepted that reality, even if they haven't all been Christians, of course.
Right. It seems like it takes a fair amount of pride actually to be a modern man and do away with these pre-modern concepts for value. You'd have to be pretty sure of yourself for that.
You're sounding like a late medieval bishop. I think
Well,
it'd be a good
perhaps
one, actually.
right, right. Yeah,
Well,
maybe we have some things in common.
right, because they accused modernizers of all kinds precisely of this pride, right? Now, to us, a lot of their preachments look obscurantist and silly, but they weren't wrong that this was the general direction things are taking away from a God and morality centered imaginary, the way in which we conceive of the universe, towards a purely human but with it material one. And in that process, the material gobbles up the human because people increasingly perceive themselves as being only material. And by the time you get to the 20th century, that process is pretty far advanced. And again, that's what Lewis is blowing the whistle on in this book. Yeah. Now, going back to what we just read there from Romans, the sacred writings of Muslims and Jews may not explicitly say the same thing, but they too are bound to suspect that God has indeed built morality in to the foundations of the universe because they too make this strong connection between religious belief in God, and morality. Now, obviously, there are some big issues there between them. They're not all the same at all, but nevertheless, they are making that kind of connection. Okay, and finally, we want to mention the basis for social engagement.
And here we have another one of your cheesy pictures, I'm afraid.
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry about this. I did the best I could.
Okay, so now under social engagement, we're including a whole range of things from politics and economics to charity and education, medicine, culture.
The whole lot, yes, the whole lot. So, Christians are in a position perhaps where I would argue, on the basis of Lewis's argument, and I'm not quite sure this is what he intended, that they can have their cake and eat it too. Because the consequence of his argument is that religious believers can seek to have the state uphold morality and disadvantage or even forbid certain kinds of immoral behavior without having to say in the next moment, because our religious tradition or our holy book says so. Right? Now, they may know that at a fundamental level those things are connected, but they don't have to say so right up front.
Right, right. So are we saying that Christians don't have to run the risk or the accusation of wanting a theocracy simply in order to get involved?
Well, they don't have to, and Lewis's argument seems to make that quite plain, right? I mean, theocracy is one of these dangerous words that gets chucked around. I mean, in America, it was actually chucked around at the administration of George Bush, George W. Bush, right? Which is completely absurd. Narrowly understood, there have been very few theocracies in the world. Calvin's Geneva was one, and at least in the early stages, maybe arguably still, the Iranian Islamist regime since 1979 has been another. By a bit of an extension, you could argue that states that have had an official religion that they then impose on everyone count as theocracies. But narrowly defined, a theocracy means a place that effectively is ruled by priests or religious leaders. But even if you want to use a very broad definition of the term, yeah, you don't have to run that risk. You can say, I'm making this argument on much broader criteria. You know, all the gods that rational men have ever believed in, all the traditional cultures in the world, all point towards the moral conclusion that you're driving for in public space. And that's a huge advantage. Okay, well, let's just remind ourselves of three different kinds of Christian positions on faith and social engagement.
Now, these three positions, are they different views held or outlooks appropriate to different historical situations?
Um, yes, they're a little bit of each. They are views typically held by Christians in those historical situations. So, firstly, there's an official church in the Middle Ages or in the Protestant Reformation, which the population is required to participate in and affirm, and its strictures and its understanding of scripture, and thus of what counts as moral, are part of public law.
Now, the understanding of scripture, of churches during the Christendom period, how all that emerged is going to be the main thread in our next series on the 4th and 5th century church.
Now, I thought you said we weren't going to advertise that until the end.
Well, I might be a little excited about it myself.
Yes, okay. Okay, yes, that's right. So morality is defined by the official churches or official religious bodies. They say what morality is. Yes, it's received through the Christian tradition and the Bible, but how it's interpreted is as defined and applied by them, right? Now, we certainly would not want to go back to that kind of situation. And as we will see in the next series, it's a terrible distortion. Okay, second position is a pluralist society with many different kinds of churches, plus other religions, plus secular people, where there is nevertheless a broadly Christian or perhaps just culturally Christian majority in which differing readings of scripture get translated into politics. So, for example, in the US and the UK in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
So the differing readings of scriptures getting translated into politics in such a situation, the period of the American Civil War would be a classic example of that.
Yes, it would, right? Where you've got one bunch of people saying slavery's in the Bible and extremely bizarre to our eyes readings of some passages in early Genesis, apparently justifying the subjugation of black people by white people, which was believed in many parts of the South to justify segregation down to the 1960s, I might add, right? So that against readings by Christians in the northern states and also many in the south, saying, no, this is absolutely terrible. And the whole point of the Christian revelation is that it shows that all people matter to God and are equal in his sight, and therefore slavery is an abomination, and so on and so on. I mean, there are problems actually with. There's obvious problems with the first. There's even a problem with the second reading, but we can't pursue that here. But yes, that's what happened. And thirdly, something much more like our own situation. Christians are a minority, as they were in the early church, and they are now, from which position Christians do not seek to indicate rules for society as a whole on the basis of some reading of their scriptures or religious tradition. Rather, they seek to be salt and light, as in the commands given by Jesus in the Gospels.
And so now we're back with your Anabaptist point.
Well, yes, that Christianity is not intended to be a way of running society. It's calling people out of the world to follow Christ, right? And those people then constitute the church. They're not a program for running wider society. And certainly that was the view taken by the early church. We'll look at a whole load of this in the coming series that starts next week, and then that gets transformed during the course of the 4th and early 5th centuries. We'll look at that as well. But we are in something like that kind of situation now, even though an awful lot of Christians in the present want to lean back to the second situation that we described a moment ago under number 2 there, right? And you will get rather political type Christians talking about claiming their country back and all this kind of thing. right? That's what's going on there. But the reality is that we are in situation number three.
So Lewis himself would have been living in a time more like the second situation with a cultural Christian majority. But you think that he would have supported this salt and light role, sort of Anabaptist point that we find ourselves in now.
He is living in a period, and his argument reflects this, that is a transition from position number two to position number three. Right. Formally and in a purely cultural sense, Britain in 1943 was a Christian country. Informally, most people didn't go to church. And most of the movers and shakers that dominated society in politics, academia, and elsewhere weren't religious at all. And people like Lewis were already a minority in those circles, but even really in the wider society. And that doesn't become completely obvious until you get through to the 60s and 70s. Yeah.
I think you just like to believe that he would have agreed with you.
Well, yeah, that's true. And I need to be careful of not trying to cut a C.S. Lewis into my own shape, as people notoriously do with someone like Bonhoeffer, for example, right? I have my own little take on him as well. And then I think, do I think that because I just want to? Stop it, stop it. Right. And I don't think I'm doing that with Lewis. In any case, we've got good hard evidence to show that he was a very definite Anglican. Right. So embracing the state church and the liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard for me to pretend that he would have agreed with me in those kind of areas. Okay, well, there are some other problems with all of this. Different faiths have varying histories over the relationship between the internal ethics of their own faith, the ethics that are taught by their religious leaders, by their religious tradition, by their scriptures, and the ethics of society as a whole that should be upheld by law. What is the relationship between those two things? We've just discussed how that's changed over time in the case of Christianity. Now, in the Old Testament, Jews saw these things as one and the same.
Because Old Testament Judaism was all about a national religion, so state and society were one and the same until they weren't because invasions.
Right. So when we look at the Old Testament law, it's clearly designed to be a public law, isn't it? With all kinds of stipulations for how people are to behave and even punishments and this kind of thing. But the Jews haven't really had a state or society of their own since the 3rd century BC, right, when the Greeks invaded. And although there were Jewish kings in Roman Judea and so on, they were very much puppet kings of the Romans. So they haven't had their own state. And not long after that, and this is something we discussed in our very first series on the history of the Jews, they were dispersed all over the place. So they've been just like a little minority everywhere. Now, Muslims historically have seen no separation between faith and politics. The whole thing is a unity. And that means that although Muslims are able to cope with the idea of non Muslims living among them in a Muslim run society, and they have all kinds of regulations about how that is to work and how the non-Muslims should have definitely an inferior place in a Muslim society. They haven't really had any theory about how Muslims are to live in a non-Muslim society. Right? Whereas precisely that circumstance has now occurred in many parts of the world and in almost all Western countries. It's often been waived in practice. But that puts a lot of Muslims living in non-Muslim countries in a bit of a dilemma and goes some way to accounting for some of them going over to extreme radicalism. Now, as we mentioned a moment ago, Christians initially took a completely opposite position, right? That there's the state running itself over there, and government is put in place by God simply to keep order. but we have an ethic that goes beyond any possibility of being turned into public law. Think of the Sermon on the Mount. You can't possibly imagine any of the teachings there being turned into public law. They're expressed in a way that explicitly makes that impossible. Right? It's all about your insides and your inner disposition and so on.
Right.
And that held good for the first 300 years. But that separation was stood on its head by the events of the 4th century, for reasons we're going to be exploring at length in the next series. And Christians have been a little confused on the point ever since, and remain so. Now,
Yeah.
some years ago, this point was driven home to me rather forcefully, because while I was doing my postgrad research and my family and I were starving by faith, I think is the right expression, I needed to take on some part-time work so that we could, continue to eat every other week or so. And so applied for a job teaching business studies at a Jewish school. I can't now remember whether this was just before or just after my business exporting ice to Eskimos, but there we are.
What what qualified you for teaching business classes?
Okay, well, for that, I have to go back to a yet earlier incarnation when I was a drone working for Swansea City Council after just leaving college and going to what an earlier generation would have called night school to get to study management studies. And I hated it. It was so boring. And I kept falling asleep in all the classes because we went after work. My classmates came to refer to me as the dormouse, like in Alice in Wonderland. The Mad Hatter's Party. Okay, and the only stuff that I truly imbibed was the economics and actually the statistics. So, on this slender basis, I mean, I did qualify in the end. I applied to teach business studies in this Jewish school on a part-time basis. So, I remember having an interview with the headmaster of this place, Carmel College. He was a lovely man, Philip Skelzer, I think his name was. And we had a great chat. He clearly liked me because at the end of the interview, he handed me over to the head of business studies and said, if this man knows anything about business, hire him. Which he did. But anyway, yeah, I need to get back to the point here. He was a bit disconcerted about what I was researching and who I was, the kind of person. And when I say disconcerted, no, he was curious. That's what we need to say there, I think. And I told him that I was particularly interested in 16th century radicals and Anabaptists. And then this idea came to me like a flash, which I explained to him. I said, it's an incredible irony. Your religion, Judaism, starts as a way of running society in the Old Testament. But for nearly all of your existence, for 2,000 years now, you've lived as a religious sect. And Christianity started its existence as a religious sect and was intended to remain that way. And in the 4th century, got upended to being a horrible, draconian system of running society. All the ones I'm researching, the Anabaptists, are the ones who said, blow all this, let's go back to the origins. And he was rather impressed by that.
No wonder this is such an important point to you.
Right. Okay, so let's just come to a close here. So C.S. Lewis's reputation then continues to grow in the present. He's far more influential today than he was during his own lifetime. And he was quite influential in his own lifetime, but it's really taken wing in the time since his death in November 1963. Okay, so we hope you enjoyed that little exposition, people. And please do let us know in the comments what you think about that and why, please, rather than simply putting a rude word and running away. Say what you think we did wrong. That can only help things. Um,
Rude words about Mike are welcome, though.
oh, I thought you had bought the franchise on that, actually.
It's good to keep in competition.
Right, yes. Oh, she's a capitalist. Right. Okay, so next week we're starting a brand new series, commencing a long anticipated second series on early Christianity. If you missed the first one, please do go back and have a look at it. And it'll really give perspective for the kinds of things we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. So, what happened once the church was no longer persecuted, but actually embraced by the Roman authorities? What dramatic changes did that bring in?
No longer being persecuted had to be a good thing, but it led to disastrous results, right?
Yes, and we're going to be spending the next few weeks expatiating upon that long drawn out disaster and where it led. Yes, but obviously stopping persecution has to be a good thing. Nobody's arguing that's good, but it's what happened, during the 2 or 3 generations that followed that created a whole load of issues from which we are still not free today. So, yes, please do tune in, everybody, next week to follow us on that one. And we hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you for staying with us.
We'll see you guys next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye now.